The golden ballroom of the Obsidian Heights Club smelled of ancient cologne and expensive fear. Serafina Frost adjusted the waist of her emerald green waitress uniform, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric that felt like a cheap costume in a room full of designer silk. This was the annual Solstice Gala, an event where Manhattan's supernatural elite gathered to remind the world who really held the strings. Mr. Sterling, the manager with eyes as sharp as the silver trays he obsessed over, caught Serafina by the shoulder with a grip that left a dull ache. "You are 3 minutes behind on the East tables, Serafina," he hissed, his breath smelling of bitter espresso. "If you drop one more glass, your next paycheck will be spent paying for the shards instead of your rent." Serafina didn't look up, focusing instead on the way her own reflection in his polished shoes looked small and distorted. "I understand, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the fatigue weighing down her limbs. She maneuvered through the crowd, carrying a tray of blood wine that glowed like melted rubies under the massive crystal chandeliers. Among the guests, a high-ranking noblewoman named Lady Elara watched Serafina's approach with a calculated sneer. As Serafina passed, Lady Elara subtly extended a pointed heel. The world tilted. Serafina felt the weight of the tray shift and gravity took over. The ruby shattered. Deep red liquid splattered across the marble floor, drenching Lady Elara's ivory gown. The music didn't stop, but the laughter nearby died into a predatory silence. "You clumsy peasant," Elara said, her voice a cold lash that drew every eye in the vicinity. "Do you have any idea how many human lives this dress is worth?" Serafina scrambled to her knees, her hands shaking as she reached for the larger pieces of glass. "I am so sorry, my lady. I slipped." Mr. Sterling was there in an instant, his face a mask of performative outrage to appease the noblewoman. "Down on your knees, Serafina," Sterling barked, pointing at the mess. "Clean every drop. Use your uniform if you have to." The humiliation felt like ice water in her veins as she knelt before the mocking crowd. She didn't see the heavy shadow shifting on the high balcony above. She didn't notice the way the temperature in the room began to drop, making the guest's breath turn into faint mist. Serafina kept her head down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a scholarship student working 3 jobs to survive, a nobody in a world of monsters. But as she reached for a shard near the center of the spill, a small, pale hand reached out from the shadows of the velvet curtains. A child with eyes like molten gold and messy dark curls crawled toward her. It was baby Leo, the heir everyone whispered about with terror. Without warning, the infant prince lunged forward and clamped his tiny, sharp fangs directly onto Serafina's emerald sleeve. The ballroom went completely still. Sterling gasped, his face turning ghostly white as he waited for the child to tear the waitress apart. Lady Elara backed away, a hand over her mouth. Everyone expected Serafina to scream or faint. Instead, Serafina looked at the tiny boy attached to her arm and felt a strange, inexplicable surge of warmth. She didn't pull away in fear. She didn't shake him off. She simply smiled a soft, tired smile that reached her eyes. "Not for eating, little prince," she whispered. She reached out with her free hand and gently tugged the fabric back, then gave his small nose a playful boop. The child froze, his golden eyes wide with a confusion that mirrored the entire room. Before we go on, do you think Serafina is incredibly brave or just has nothing left to lose? And tell me where you're watching from. The heavy silence in the ballroom felt thick enough to suffocate the 100 immortals standing frozen under the crystal chandeliers. Serafina remained on her knees, her hand resting near baby Leo as he maintained his stubborn grip on her emerald silk sleeve. The infant prince made a small, contented sound that bypassed the predatory instincts of every noble in the room. Lady Alara took a sharp step back, her ivory heels clicking like a death knell against the marble floor. She looked at Mr. Sterling, who had turned a shade of gray usually reserved for the dead. The manager dropped the silver tray he was holding. It clattered with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through Serafina's very bones. She didn't look at the crowd. Her focus remained entirely on the child. Leo's golden eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that felt far too old for his tiny frame. He didn't look like a monster to her. He looked like a lonely boy who had finally found something familiar in a room full of statues. A cold breeze swept through the hall, extinguishing the candles in the wall sconces one by one. The shadows at the edge of the ballroom began to bleed inward, stretching across the floor like ink spilled on white paper. The temperature continued to fall until Serafina could see her own shallow breaths forming mist in the air. Alistair Vance materialized in the center of the spill without making a single sound. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his cascading dark curls framing a face of such pale perfection it made the surrounding vampires look like crude sketches. His obsidian eyes scanned the scene, landing first on the red wine staining the floor, then on the noblewoman, and finally on the girl kneeling in the mess. Alistair moved toward them with a predatory grace that made the crowd part as if moved by an invisible hand. He didn't look at Sterling or Alara. He stopped inches from Serafina, his presence casting a shadow that completely enveloped her small form. Serafina felt the weight of his gaze. She finally lifted her chin, meeting the king's eyes even as her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Alistair looked down at his son, who was now leaning his forehead against Serafina's arm. The king went completely still. He had spent months watching Leo reject every highborn nanny and ancient bloodline offered to him. His son was cursed to be feral, yet he was now purring like a kitten against a human waitress. Alistair reached out, his long, pale fingers hovering just above Serafina's wrist. He didn't touch her yet. He merely inhaled, catching the scent of a soul that didn't belong in this dark cathedral of wealth. "My lady," Alistair said, his voice a velvet blade that sliced through the silence. He was looking at Lady Alara now. The noblewoman tried to find her voice, but it failed her. Alistair stepped over the shattered glass, his polished boots never touching a single drop of wine. "You spoke of value," he murmured, his eyes flashing with a sudden golden fire. "Tell me, Alara, what is the price for insulting the woman my heir has chosen as his anchor?" The question hung in the frigid air like a death warrant. Lady Alara crumbled, her knees hitting the marble beside the wine spill. Sterling tried to flee toward the kitchen, but he found his feet rooted to the floor by Alistair's sheer will. The king turned back to Serafina and offered a hand that looked like cold marble carved in moonlight. "Stand up, Serafina Frost," he commanded softly. "From this heartbeat, you serve no master but the throne." Serafina took his hand, feeling the impossible cold of his skin meeting her human warmth. She stood, but as she leaned down to pick up baby Leo, Alistair beat her to it. He lifted the child with one arm, while keeping his other hand possessively on the small of Serafina's back. He led her toward the grand exit, leaving the elite of Manhattan to stare at the empty space where a waitress had just become the most powerful woman in their world. Serafina didn't see the member of the High Council watching from the balcony. The councilman tightened his grip on a ring of poisoned silver, his eyes narrowing as he realized the king's only weakness had just been revealed. If the king had found an anchor, the council had found a target. Alistair felt the threat through the air and pulled Serafina closer to his side as the heavy doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind them. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom slammed shut with a finality that made the crystal chandeliers rattle in their gold sockets. Alistair Vance did not look back at the room full of stunned immortals or the man he had just reduced to a prisoner of his own fear. His hand remained firm on the small of Seraphina's back as he guided her through the dimly lit corridors of the club toward a private elevator. Baby Leo had fallen into a deep, rhythmic slumber against Alistair's shoulder, his tiny fingers still tangled in the torn thread of Seraphina's emerald sleeve. Seraphina walked in a daze, her senses overwhelmed by the lingering scent of ozone and the biting cold that radiated from the man beside her. They entered the elevator, and the doors slid shut with a whisper. The small space amplified the sound of her frantic heartbeat. She leaned against the mirrored wall, her eyes fixed on the floor. Alistair watched her reflection. He saw the tremble in her hands and the way she bit her lip to keep it from quivering. The golden fire in his eyes had faded back to a deep, watchful obsidian. "You are safe," Alistair said. His voice was low and carried the vibration of a cello string. Seraphina looked up, catching his gaze in the mirror. "You fired him," she whispered, her mind finally catching up to the reality of Mr. Sterling's expulsion. Alistair adjusted the sleeping child in his arms. "I did more than that, Seraphina. I removed a parasite that thought it could feed on your dignity." The elevator opened directly into a penthouse suite that looked like it had been carved from the very night sky. Black marble floors stretched toward floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering sprawl of Manhattan. Alistair led her toward a plush velvet sofa and waited until she sat down before placing Leo in a nearby bassinet made of dark, polished wood. He moved with a grace that felt predatory even when he was being gentle. Seraphina looked around the room, feeling like an intruder in a cathedral of ancient power. Alistair walked to a side table and poured a glass of water, handing it to her. His fingers brushed hers for a fleeting second. The touch was as cold as ice, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her human veins. "Drink," he commanded softly. Seraphina took a sip, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. She looked at the king, who was now standing by the window with his back to her. His long dark curls fell over his shoulders like a silken veil. "Why did Leo choose me?" she asked. The question had been burning in her chest since the moment the prince had latched onto her sleeve. Alistair turned slowly. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze tracing the lines of her face with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "My son is a creature of instinct," he began, taking a step closer. "He does not see a waitress or a scholarship student. He sees a soul that resonates with a frequency he has been searching for since the day he was born. He stopped just inches from her. He chose you because you are his anchor, Seraphina. And in choosing his anchor, he has chosen mine." Seraphina felt the walls of her reality crumbling. She was a girl who lived by budgets and bus schedules, not by ancient prophecies and blood bonds. She stood up, needing to put space between herself and the magnetic pull of his presence. "I have a life, Alistair. I have school. I have rent." Alistair reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, but never quite touching. "You have a destiny. The world you lived in yesterday is gone. Tonight, you became the most precious treasure in my kingdom. And I never let go of what is mine." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. Seraphina looked at the sleeping prince and then at the man who ruled the darkness with a smile that could freeze time. She realized then that she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a target. Across the city, in a basement lit by red candles, a group of vampires in gray robes gathered around a table. They watched a video of the ballroom incident on a tablet. The leader, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, looked at the image of Seraphina Frost and smiled. "The king has found his heart," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "Now we know where to sink the silver." Alistair felt a sudden, sharp pang of alarm through the air and pulled Seraphina into his arms before she could protest. He held her against his cold chest, his eyes scanning the empty suite as if he could see the shadows conspiring against them. He didn't say a word, but the way he tightened his grip told her everything she needed to know. The war had just begun. Seraphina closed her eyes, listening to the silence of the night, unaware that her very existence was now the only thing keeping the world from falling into total darkness. Alistair whispered a promise into her hair that only the gods could hear. He would burn Manhattan to the ground before he let them take her. Seraphina shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that her life was no longer her own. She was the king's anchor, and the storm was coming for them both. Alistair's eyes turned a lethal gold as he stared into the night, waiting for the first sign of the hunters. He was ready for the blood. He was ready for the fire. But he wasn't ready for the way Seraphina's hand slowly reached up and touched his arm, offering him a warmth he hadn't felt in 1,000 years. It was a simple gesture, yet it shattered the last of his iron control. He looked down at her and knew that for this woman, he would become the monster the legends feared. The king had found his queen, and the council was about to learn why Alistair Vance had survived for 10 centuries. Seraphina looked at baby Leo and felt a fierce, protective instinct flare in her chest. She wouldn't just be an anchor. She would be a shield. Alistair saw the change in her eyes and smiled. It was a beautiful, terrible thing to behold. Together, they watched the city lights, two dauntless souls standing at the edge of forever. The hunt was on, and they were the prize. Seraphina took a deep breath, the scent of midnight and jasmine filling her lungs. She was ready. Alistair led her toward the private chambers, his shadow stretching long and dark across the marble floor. They were a family now, bound by a bite and a boop on the nose. And the council would pay in silver and blood for even thinking about tearing them apart. Seraphina stepped into the dark, following the vampire king into a world she never knew existed, leaving her old life behind like a discarded sleeve. Seraphina stepped into the private chambers of the penthouse, and the air changed instantly. The scent of ancient wood and ozone from the ballroom was replaced by the crisp fragrance of white lilies. Alistair placed baby Leo into a cradle of carved obsidian that seemed to absorb the dim light of the moon. The child let out a soft sigh, and the faint glow in his eyes dimmed as he settled into sleep. Seraphina stood near the door with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She watched the rise and fall of the child's chest. "He looks so peaceful now," she whispered. Alistair didn't turn around. He leaned over the cradle and adjusted a silk blanket around the boy. "He has not slept for more than 2 hours at a time since the moon turned," Alistair said. His voice was a low hum that felt like a physical touch against Seraphina's skin. He finally straightened and walked toward her. His movement was so fluid that he seemed to blur the distance between them. Alistair stopped a respectful 2 feet away. He looked down at her torn sleeve where Leo's fangs had left small punctures in the fabric. "Your arm," he murmured. Alistair reached out and gently took her forearm in his cool hand. Seraphina didn't flinch. She looked at his pale fingers against her skin and felt a strange calm. "It is just a shirt, Alistair," she said. She tried to offer a small smile, but it faltered under the intensity of his gaze. Alistair ran a thumb over the fabric near the bite marks. "My son did not just bite you," he whispered. "He marked you." Seraphina pulled her arm back slowly. She walked toward a large bookshelf that held volumes bound in leather older than the city below. "What does that mean?" she asked. Alistair watched her move. He saw the way she traced the spines of the books with a curious touch. "It means your soul carries a light that calms his darkness," Alistair explained. He moved to a mahogany desk and picked up a small silver key. "The council believes he is a weapon because they cannot control him." Alistair looked at the key in his palm. "But he is just a child who was born into a storm." Serafina turned to face him. "And what am I to you?" she asked. Alistair went still. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen. He crossed the room until he was standing directly in front of her. Alistair reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You are the only person who looked at the king of the night and didn't see a monster," he said softly. He leaned down until his lips were inches from her forehead. "You are the heart I thought I had lost 10 centuries ago." Serafina felt her breath catch in her throat. The heat from her own body seemed to struggle against the beautiful cold radiating from him. She looked up into his obsidian eyes and saw a hunger that had nothing to do with blood. Alistair cooped her face in both hands. "I will give you everything," he promised. "The world will bow to you." Serafina shook her head slightly. "I don't want the world, Alistair," she whispered. She reached up and placed her hands over his. "I just want to know that Leo is safe." Alistair's expression hardened. He looked toward the balcony where the city lights continued to flicker. "He will be," Alistair growled. "But the council has already seen you." He let his hands fall from her face. "They will try to take the anchor to sink the ship." Serafina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked back at the sleeping prince. She knew Alistair was right. Her life as a waitress was over. She was now part of a war that had been raging for 1,000 years. Serafina straightened her shoulders. She looked at the vampire king with a new fire in her eyes. "Then let them come," she said. "I am not afraid of shadows anymore." Alistair smiled, and it was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. He took her hand and led her toward the window. "Good," he whispered, "because the sun is about to set on their era." Behind them, the obsidian cradle began to glow with a faint silver light. Leo was waking up. And this time he wasn't crying. He was laughing. The laughter coming from the obsidian cradle carried a strange melodic chime that seemed to push back the oppressive shadows of the penthouse. Alistair Vance moved toward his son with a speed that blurred his form into a streak of midnight silk. He reached into the cradle and lifted baby Leo, who was kicking his small legs against the mattress with newfound vigor. The infant prince reached out both hands toward Serafina as his tiny chest puffed with delight. Alistair watched the interaction with a profound stillness that betrayed his inner shock. His son had spent the last 8 months in a state of constant agitation and primal hunger. Every elite nanny and noble blood heir had been met with snarling fangs and violent rejection. Now the most dangerous infant in the supernatural world was reaching for a girl who smelled of cheap dish soap and exhaustion. Alistair handed the boy to Serafina. She accepted the weight of the child naturally and tucked his head into the crook of her neck. Leo sighed against her emerald uniform while his small hand gripped her finger with a strength that would have crushed a human who didn't carry her hidden grace. Alistair walked to the mahogany desk and opened a heavy drawer. He pulled out a small silver vial containing a glowing amber liquid. "The council believes his condition is a sickness of the blood," Alistair said while staring at the vial. He turned it slowly between his pale fingers. "They want to use this to neutralize his spirit so they can mold him into a puppet king." He looked back at Serafina, who was gently swaying with the baby. "But I realized tonight that he isn't sick." Alistair set the vial down on the desk and crossed the room until he stood directly in front of her. He was just waiting for his resonance. Serafina felt the child's heartbeat syncing with her own. It was a rhythmic thrum that resonated in her bones like a low-frequency drum. She looked at Alistair and noticed the way his obsidian eyes searched her face for a sign of fear that never came. "I feel it too," she whispered. The warmth from the child was spreading through her veins and healing the fatigue that had claimed her for years. Alistair reached out and traced the line of her jaw with the back of his hand. His touch was cold, but she didn't flinch away. "You are more than an anchor, Seraphina," he murmured. "You are the key to a door I thought was locked forever." He moved closer until the scent of lilies and ancient winter enveloped her completely. "But the High Council will not let this bond exist in peace." Seraphina held Leo tighter as she felt a sudden shift in the air. The temperature didn't drop this time, but a heavy static charge began to vibrate through the floorboards. Alistair's golden fire returned to his gaze as he looked toward the reinforced penthouse doors. "They are here," he growled. He didn't have to explain who he meant. The heavy thud of boots echoing in the hallway outside confirmed his words. Alistair didn't move to hide her. He stepped to her side and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Let them see the woman who tamed a prince," he commanded. The doors were kicked open and 3 vampires in ash-gray robes entered with silver-tipped spears held ready. They were the king's guard, but they answered to the council. The leader stepped forward and looked at the human waitress holding the royal heir. "Alistair Vance," the guard stated with a voice like grinding stones. "The council demands the human be surrendered for evaluation." Alistair let out a laugh that sounded like ice cracking under a heavy weight. He didn't even look at the spears pointed at his chest. "Surrender." Alistair stepped forward while his shadow expanded until it touched the ceiling. "Tell the council that if they want to evaluate my anchor, they can come and try to take her from my hands." He bared his fangs, and the room filled with a terrifying golden light. The guards hesitated while the weight of a 1,000-year-old predator pressed against their wills. Seraphina stood her ground beside the king and felt the fire in her own blood beginning to rise. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the one thing the darkness could never extinguish. Alistair looked at her one last time before the room erupted into motion. "Stay behind me, love," he whispered. "I'm going to show them why I am the only king who matters." The first guard lunged and Alistair caught the spear with his bare hand as the metal began to glow white with his rage. The white glow from the spear illuminated Alistair's face and revealed a terrifying calm that chilled the air more than the winter outside. He didn't flinch as the silver-tipped weapon hummed against his palm. The metal began to groan under the sheer pressure of his grip. With a short and effortless flick of his wrist, the king snapped the heavy shaft into 2 useless pieces. He tossed the fragments onto the black marble floor where they clattered with a sound like falling coins. The 3 guards froze as their training collided with the reality of an ancient predator's fury. Seraphina stepped back into the safety of the shadows while holding baby Leo tightly against her chest. She felt the child's heartbeat racing, but his eyes remained locked on his father with a look of pure and silent adoration. Alistair adjusted his black suit jacket and stepped over the broken silver. He looked at the leader of the guards with obsidian eyes that were slowly bleeding into a lethal gold. "Go back to the council," Alistair said. His voice was a velvet blade that seemed to vibrate the very glass in the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Tell them my anchor is not a subject for evaluation." The guard leader gripped his remaining dagger with trembling fingers. He looked at the human waitress and then back at the king who had ruled for 10 centuries. "The treaty is clear, Your Majesty," the guard stammered. Alistair smiled, and it was a beautiful and terrible sight to behold. "I am the treaty," he whispered. He moved with a speed that the human eye could not track and appeared directly in front of the messenger. Alistair didn't strike. He simply leaned in until his cold breath touched the guard's ear. "If any of you set foot in this penthouse again, I will erase your entire bloodline before the next moonrise." The weight of his authority was a physical force that pushed the three men toward the open doors. They turned and fled into the hallway without looking back. Silence returned to the suite, but it was a heavy and charged silence. Alistair turned to Seraphina, and the gold in his gaze softened into a warm amber. He walked toward her and reached out to touch the small hand of his son. Leo reached back and grabbed his father's finger while letting out a soft and melodic chirp. Alistair looked at Seraphina with an expression she hadn't seen before. It was a mixture of profound relief and a possessiveness that made her skin tingle. "They will not stop," she said quietly. She looked at the puncture marks on her sleeve and realized her old life was drifting away like ash in the wind. Alistair cooped her face in one hand, and his palm was cold as a Richmond winter. "Let them try," he murmured. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. "No one touches what is mine, Seraphina. Not the council and not the gods themselves." Seraphina leaned into his touch and accepted the impossible cold that felt more like home than any human warmth she had ever known. She looked toward the balcony and saw the first light of dawn touching the peaks of the skyscrapers. The night was over, but the true hunt was just beginning. Alistair pulled her closer, and his shadow merged with hers on the marble floor. They stood as one while the vampire prince slept between them. The king had found his anchor, and the world was about to learn that some bonds were never meant to be broken. Alistair led her toward the inner sanctum of the penthouse while his eyes scanned the horizon for the next storm. He was ready for the war because he finally had something worth protecting. Seraphina followed him into the darkness and felt the fire in her blood whispering secrets of a power she was only beginning to understand. The council thought she was a weakness, but they were about to discover she was the king's greatest strength. Alistair closed the heavy bedroom doors, and the click of the lock echoed like a final verdict. The waitress was gone, and a queen was rising in her place. The heavy bedroom doors closed with a metallic click that resonated through the silent hallway of the penthouse. Inside the inner sanctum, the air felt different than the rest of the suite. It smelled of vanilla and aged parchment. Alistair placed baby Leo onto a massive bed draped in black silk. The child immediately curled into a small ball and began to dream of silver rivers. Alistair watched the boy for a long minute before turning his attention to Seraphina. She stood near the foot of the bed while her hands smoothed the wrinkled fabric of her emerald uniform. The reality of her situation was finally settling into her bones. She was no longer Seraphina Frost the waitress. She was a woman protected by a king who had just threatened to erase an entire bloodline for her sake. Alistair walked toward a small cabinet and retrieved a clean white shirt made of the finest cotton. He held it out to her while his eyes remained fixed on the tear in her own sleeve. "Change into this," he murmured. His voice lacked the edge of the king and carried only the quiet concern of a man. Seraphina took the shirt. The fabric felt like a cloud against her fingertips. "Alistair, what happens tomorrow?" she asked. She looked at the white shirt and then back at him. Alistair moved to the window and stared out at the city that lay beneath his feet. "Tomorrow the council will realize that I was not making an idle threat." He kept his hands behind his back. "They will move against us because they fear any variable they cannot predict." Seraphina sat on the edge of the bed near Leo. She felt the warmth radiating from the child. "But Leo is just a baby," she said softly. Alistair turned his head slightly to look at her. "He is the first pureblood airborne in 400 years, Seraphina." He stepped away from the window and approached her. "To them, he is a crown to be worn or a weapon to be pointed." Alistair knelt on the floor in front of her. He placed his pale hands on her knees, but didn't exert any pressure. "But to me, he is my son." Serafina reached out and touched Alistair's hair. The dark curls felt like silk between her fingers. She saw the exhaustion hidden beneath his immortal mask. "And I am the anchor," she whispered. Alistair leaned his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes and inhaled the scent of her human life. "You are the only thing that keeps his blood from boiling." He moved his hands to cup her face. "And you are the only reason I still remember what it feels like to be alive." Serafina leaned into his palms. She accepted the cold that no longer felt like a threat. A sudden vibration moved through the floor. It wasn't a static charge or the sound of boots. It was a low and ancient hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. Alistair stiffened. He pulled back and stood up in one smooth motion. His obsidian eyes scanned the ceiling as the hum grew louder. "The council is desperate," he growled. He looked at Leo, who was now stirring in his sleep. "They're not coming for you with spears this time." Alistair grabbed a heavy leather jacket from the chair and threw it over his shoulders. "They are using the Song of the First," he explained. Serafina stood up and clutched the white shirt to her chest. "What is that?" she asked. Alistair reached for Leo and tucked the boy into a travel carrier. "It is a blood call that can force any vampire of his lineage to return to the Citadel." Alistair's jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. "They are trying to rip my son out of this room without even being here." Leo opened his eyes, and they were no longer gold. They were a dull and lifeless gray. The child didn't cry. He simply stared at the door as if he were a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Serafina rushed to the child's side and placed her hand on his chest. "Leo, stay with me," she pleaded. The warmth from her palm seemed to fight against the gray light in the boy's eyes. Alistair watched the color flicker back to a faint amber. He looked at Serafina with a desperate hope. "Your resonance is the only thing stronger than the call," Alistair whispered. He took her hand and pulled her toward a hidden door behind the bookshelf. "We cannot stay in Manhattan." Serafina didn't ask where they were going. She followed the king into the dark passage while the child's heartbeat thrummed against her soul. The war had moved from the ballroom to the blood itself. Alistair closed the hidden door, and the hum of the city was replaced by the silence of the deep earth. They were running. But for the first time in 10 centuries, the king wasn't running from his enemies. He was running toward a future he finally believed in. Alistair gripped her hand tighter as they descended into the dark. "I will keep you both safe," he promised. "Even if I have to break every law of the night." Serafina felt the weight of the silver vial in her pocket. She had taken it from the desk when Alistair wasn't looking. She didn't know if it was medicine or poison, but she knew she would use it if it meant saving the boy who had chosen her sleeve. The hunt had changed, and the anchor was about to become the captain. The underground tunnel smelled of damp earth and ancient pine resin. Alistair held Serafina's hand with a grip that was firm but carefully calibrated to avoid bruising her human skin. They emerged into a secluded mountain ridge 3 hours north of the city where a rustic cabin sat hidden beneath a canopy of silver fir trees. Alistair placed baby Leo into a portable bassinet inside the cabin and checked the perimeter with a single sweeping glance. The child was finally asleep again, and the dull gray in his eyes had retreated to a soft amber glow. Serafina leaned against the rough wooden kitchen counter and pulled the silver vial from her pocket. The amber liquid inside shimmered under the dim battery-powered lantern light. Alistair turned and his eyes locked onto the glass container in her hand. He didn't move toward her, but the air in the small room grew thin. "Where did you get that?" Alistair asked. His voice was a quiet growl that made the glass window panes hum. Serafina held the vial up and her fingers felt the slight warmth of the fluid. "I took it from your desk when you were focused on the guards," she admitted. She watched his reaction and saw the way his jaw tightened. Alistair walked to the window and stared at the dark forest. "That liquid is the catalyst," he whispered. "The council engineered it to strip a vampire of their primal essence. If Leo drinks it, he will never be feral, but he will also never be a king." Alistair turned back to her, and his obsidian eyes were filled with a raw conflict. He would be safe, Serafina, but he would be a shadow of himself. Serafina looked at the sleeping prince and then at the powerful man standing before her. She understood now why the council was so desperate. They didn't want to save Leo. They wanted to erase him. A sharp crack echoed from the forest outside like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. Alistair was at the door before the sound had fully faded. He bared his fangs, and a low vibration started in his chest. "They are not using spears this time," Alistair warned. A figure emerged from the tree-line, wearing armor reinforced with silver filigree. It was High Councilman Malthus. He held a longbow carved from ancient yew, and an arrow tipped with a jagged crystal. Malthus didn't aim at the king. He aimed directly at the window where Serafina was standing. "Alistair," Malthus called out. His voice was a cold rasp that seemed to freeze the falling leaves. "The anchor is a liability the council will no longer tolerate. Step aside and let us correct the bloodline." Alistair stepped out onto the porch, and his shadow stretched across the clearing like a great predatory bird. "You aim at her, and you forfeit your existence," Alistair promised. He didn't wait for a response. The king moved with a violence that was beautiful and terrifying. He caught the crystal arrow in midair just inches from the wood siding of the cabin. The crystal shattered in his palm and released a cloud of silver dust that hissed against his skin. Alistair ignored the burn and lunged toward the trees. Serafina watched from the kitchen, and her heart felt like it was going to burst. She looked at the vial in her hand, and then at baby Leo. She realized then that Alistair couldn't protect both of them at once. Serafina uncorked the vial and felt the power of the catalyst vibrating against her skin. She didn't pour it for the baby. She raised the glass to her own lips. "If I am the anchor, then I will be the one to hold the storm," she whispered. Alistair let out a roar of pure agony as he sensed her intent through their bond. He turned back toward the cabin, but Malthus was already drawing a second arrow. The king was trapped between his duty to his son and his love for the woman who had finally made him feel alive. Serafina swallowed the liquid and felt a fire explode in her veins that turned the world white. The waitress was gone, and something ancient was waking up in her blood. Serafina walked out onto the porch, and the silver dust in the air began to swirl around her like a protective shield. Malthus froze, and his yew bough fell to the grass. He stared at the human girl who was now radiating a golden light that rivaled the rising sun. Alistair stopped in his tracks and watched his anchor transform into his greatest weapon. The council had tried to sink the ship, but they had only succeeded in creating a queen. The golden light radiating from Serafina Frost did not just illuminate the clearing, but seemed to rewrite the laws of the night itself. High Councilman Malthus collapsed to his knees as the ancient power vibrating in Serafina's blood stripped the silver-tipped arrows of their lethal intent. Alistair Vance stood paralyzed for 3 heartbeats while he watched the woman he protected become the shield for his entire world. The liquid catalyst had not erased her humanity, but instead acted as a bridge to a legacy she never knew she carried. Alistair reached her side in a blur of motion, and his hands were trembling as they hovered near her glowing skin. "Serafina," Alistair whispered, and his voice was thick with a raw reverence that echoed through the trees. Serafina turned to him, and her eyes were no longer just human amber, but burned with a soft and steady solar fire. She reached out and took his hand while her warmth finally matched the intensity of his immortal chill. "I did not swallow it to stop being human, Alistair," she said softly. Her voice carried a melodic resonance that made the nearby flowers bloom in the middle of winter. "I took it so we could finally be equal." Alistair pulled her against his chest, and he felt the fire in her veins calming the ancient storm that had lived in his heart for 1,000 years. Behind them, the cabin door creaked open. Baby Leo stepped out onto the porch, and his eyes were now a clear and vibrant gold. The gray fog of the blood call had vanished completely. The child laughed and reached for both of them while the silver dust in the air settled into the grass like fallen stars. Alistair looked down at Malphas, who was still staring at Serafina in a state of religious terror. "Tell the council that the anchor has risen," Alistair commanded while his obsidian gaze turned to the horizon. "There will be no more puppets and no more weapons." He stepped over the fallen bough and helped Serafina carry their son back toward the ridge. The elite world of Manhattan felt like a distant and shallow dream compared to the reality they were building under the morning sun. Serafina leaned her head against Alistair's shoulder. "You said I served no master but the throne," she reminded him with a small and playful smile. Alistair stopped at the edge of the forest and looked at her with a look of pure and unyielding adoration. "I was wrong, Serafina," he murmured. He leaned down and pressed a lingering kiss to her temple while the child chirped happily between them. "The throne belongs to you." They walked together into the light of a new era where a waitress was a queen and a monster was finally home. The shadows of the council retreated into the deep earth as the three of them vanished into the silver fir trees. Serafina felt the weight of the empty vial in her pocket, and she knew the catalyst was no longer needed. The bond was sealed. The hunt was over. And as the sun climbed higher over the Virginia mountains, Alistair Vance realized that for the first time in 10 centuries, he wasn't afraid of the dawn. Serafina held his hand tighter while they stepped toward the future they had forged in glass and blood. "Ready for forever, Alistair?" she asked. Alistair smiled, and it was a look of peace that could heal the world. "With you," he whispered. "Always."